In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And I looked, and behold, a whirlwind came out of the north, a great cloud, and a fire enfolding itself. And a brightness was about it, and out of the midst thereof, as the color of amber, out of the midst of the fire, came the likeness of 4 living creatures. And this was their appearance. They had the likeness of a man. And everyone had 4 faces, and everyone had 4 wings. And their feet were straight feet, and the sole of their feet was like the sole of a calf's foot, and they sparkled like the color of burnished brass. And they had the hands of a man under their wings. Now, as I beheld the living creatures, behold, one wheel upon the earth.
In an infinite universe, with an infinite capacity for life, we dwell in a remote region of a single galaxy containing a billion stars, upon a small water-laden planet we call Earth. Life forms have come and gone on this planet. The human race has been here only 1 million years. Over this period of time, we have become the most technically adept species on Earth, a technically adept species with dreams of flight. After thousands of years of trying, in 1903, 2 men in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina took to the air, reaching for the sky. The Wright brothers had done something no other human beings had ever done before, proving that man could indeed fly. Just 60 years later, human technology had become so sophisticated that we started reaching beyond the sky, into the heavens. As the 1960s began, John Glenn orbited the Earth successfully to the astonishment and cheers of millions. As the 60s ended, another era in spaceflight had begun. Today, Voyager 2, an unmanned spacecraft filled with scientific instruments and human greetings from Earth, will soon be leaving our solar system to visit other galaxies, just 80 years after the Wright brothers' first engine-powered flight. Is it possible for living creatures to visit other worlds? Is it possible for other life forms to be in contact? Our story begins here, on the banks of the Pascagoula River, an area that gained its notoriety for being the site of a rather 10 years. The first flaps that were brought to public attention occurred in the summer and fall of 1947. In April of that year, a meteorologist and his staff at the Richmond, Virginia Weather Bureau reported sighting an unusual craft while tracking weather balloons. It was flat-bottomed with a dome on top. The UFO traveled in a westerly direction and soon disappeared from sight. It was June 24th of that same year when a credible, honest businessman from Boise, Idaho, named Kenneth Arnold reported the sighting that fully captured the attention of the American public. While flying his private plane near Mount Rainier, Washington, Mr. Arnold observed 9 disc-like objects flying in formation at speeds estimated to be in excess of 1,400 miles per hour. They were moving in an unconventional manner, which Mr. Arnold would later describe not unlike a saucer if you skipped it across the water. It was the reporter that interviewed Kenneth Arnold after he landed that coined the phrase flying saucer. With the story widely distributed on wire services, Kenneth Arnold received national attention, and reports of similar sightings soon flooded in. In a recently declassified document addressed to the director of the FBI, an official at Strategic Air Command in Washington describes an incident that occurred in Roswell, New Mexico. It seems 3 so-called flying saucers were recovered, described as being circular in shape with raised centers approximately 50 feet in diameter. Each was occupied by a human-shaped body, but only 3 feet tall. Each of the 3 was clothed in a metallic cloth of a very fine texture. Each body had been bandaged in a manner similar to the blackout suits worn by speed flyers and test pilots. The document went on to say that the saucers were found due to a very high-powered radar that the government was operating in that area. It was believed that the radar interfered with the operating mechanisms of the saucers. Things seemed to quiet down toward the end of 1947, with fewer sightings being reported. In the late 40s and early 50s, the Air Force became involved in a series of projects to deal with the phenomenon of UFOs. After satisfying itself that the objects were not secret weapons from another country, the Air Force concluded that people were not accurately interpreting and reporting what they saw and experienced. The conclusion was drawn that the UFO phenomenon was due primarily to abnormal psychological and physiological states, societal stress, or hoaxes. The Air Force attempted to distance itself from the subject by eventually closing down its UFO investigation unit in hopes that people would get the message and cease to report UFO sightings. Then, On October 11th, 1973, again at the peak of a flap, an incident occurred right here on the banks of the Pascagoula River that would change the minds and attitudes of many.
I don't think I'll ever forget what did happen. Of course, it was on October 11th of '73. I was employed by F.B. Walker and Son Shipyard at that time, and Calvin was also a friend of mine. Many evenings after work, I'd go fishing on the river when I'd have time. So that day in particular, about noon, Calvin and myself had planned on going fishing that evening after work. And after we had went home and got our tackle, of course, and went down to the river, we tried several places, and we came back up by to the old Saltpeter shipyard, and I was sitting on an old pier fishing out into the river. And I don't know whether what really attracted my attention, but I heard a hissing-like sound. And when I turned and looked behind me, there was some kind of craft that was, it was probably 18 inches or a foot off of the ground, just hovering there. And there were two blue lights up toward the front of it, and they were either revolving or pulsating. And I really didn't know what to think. I didn't know what it was. It startled me at first, and I stepped down off of the pier, and I looked around, and well, I saw Calvin step down too, and he was looking at the same thing I was. And about the time we stepped on the ground, there was a door open there in the front, just seemed to appear there, probably a sliding door. And there was brilliant light that came out of from outside of the craft, just a beam of light. And there was something well, I know now it was robots, but there was something that came into the door. There was three of them, in fact, one behind the other one, and they just seemed to glide out of the door. They never touched the ground, and I didn't know what to do. I'd become quite frightened at that time, and the river's behind us. We couldn't go that way. So, and those things were getting close to us. And when they got up real close to me, I guess I just froze. I don't know, but then they came around, and one of them took hold of this arm, and I felt pain in it just instantly. And one of them took hold of the other arm, and I seemed to just rise up from the ground at the height they were, in more or less a leaning position. So they weren't very tall. I mean, I'm 5'8", and I was a little taller than they were. And about that time, Calvin, he was to my right. I saw one take hold of him, and he just went limp. And I found out later that he had passed out. He had fainted from the fear, I suppose. But anyway, these things, we just went right onto the craft through that door into that bright light, went into what was probably the middle of a room or compartment, and it appeared to me that it was round. And the light was glowing from the walls and the overhead and the floor. And we stopped about middle ways of the room, I suppose, and they just released me. I couldn't move anything but my eyes. I could move my eyes. I don't know why I could move them and couldn't move anything else. But anyway, they released me, and a few moments, I suppose it was, but out directly in front of me, something came out of the wall that it appeared to me that just a big, I always refer to it as an eye, a big pupil in an eye. And it moved up in front of my face, and it remained there for a few minutes, moments, I suppose. And it went downward and went under me, and I'm assuming it went up the backside because it came back up over my head, came back in front of me, and it remained there for a few more, probably a minute or two or more. And it moved back into the light in the wall and disappeared.
My first and only contact with Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker was on the morning of October the 12th, 1973, early in the morning. I was working in the X-ray department at the hospital, and for those of you who knew the Singer River Hospital back at that time, we had a ramp that went up back to the emergency room where the ambulances used to come up to bring the patients. And the emergency room was right next to the x-ray department, and some people from the emergency room came to the x-ray department and told me that there were some guys down in the emergency room that they had. They said, "You got to come see these guys. They claiming they got picked up by a spaceship." So me and a couple of my buddies that were there at the time sort of started laughing. You know, you got to imagine being in a hospital, some of the stories that you can hear in a hospital. So I went down to the emergency room, which is just a very few steps from the x-ray department at that time. It was early in the morning. To my understanding, they had brought Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker to the hospital very early in the morning. They had spent maybe part of the night at the sheriff's department, but at that time I didn't know anything about that. So I went down there, and they were checking these two guys out, presumably for whether drinking, drugs, or anything. I don't know if something was happening to them or whatever. I didn't get to see that portion of it. But when they got through, the two guys were standing there, and definitely to my curiosity, I was wanting to know what was going on. And right about that time, the television station out of Biloxi showed up, and it was just one cameraman with one of those shoulder cameras, and a guy that was like an announcer, interviewer, or whatever. So they asked Charles and Calvin to step out on the ramp, which right outside the door there, and I went out with them because I sort of knew the cameraman that was there at the time. I was on speaking terms with him anyway. So we went outside. I walked out with them, and I stood beside the cameraman, and the guy was interviewing Charles Hickson probably 10 feet from where we were standing. So I can very easily say that I was one of the very first people to ever hear Charles Hickson interviewed. And I listened to him. What's amazed me over the years is the fact that the exact story that I heard him tell, he hasn't changed his story at all. It was identical, and I'm sure people that are watching this program have heard his story, that it hasn't wavered. The way he describes what happened, and the whole story is exactly the same over the years. He hasn't changed at all. And the thing that roused my interest was Calvin Parker. He was standing there, and Calvin Parker was very quiet, and he seemed to me to be a very timid young man. And so I myself went over to Calvin, and we walked down, halfway down that ramp. And so I started asking Calvin what was going on, because, of course, at the first, we had a big laugh about it. And then I started listening. When I heard the story, I started thinking, this story it's got to be one of the strangest stories that I've heard. So I wanted a second opinion. So I walked down the ramp with Calvin, and I asked him about it. And Calvin, he really seemed scared. He was sort of white in the face, and he was still nervous. And he told me the story of what happened, said that they heard the noise, and he looked back, and these things came out, and they reached down to get him, and he passed out. And that's all that he remembered. That was a story that he told me. And so listening to Charles Hickson's story and seeing Calvin's reaction had me a little concerned, as to the point where it sort of wiped a little bit of the smile off of my face. And I'm still very reluctant to believe such a story, like many people are, but still in all, I'm also reluctant to call these two guys total wackos, so to speak, because listening to a story like that and then hearing it over the years and hearing the story told the same after repeated interrogation, if you want to call it, or interviews, it's got to make you sit back and listen some.
Pascagoula's Julius Bosco was one of the first physicians to examine the men.
I remember meeting them was fairly early Saturday morning, about 8 or 8:30, before really the news media or anyone else had gotten to them. I was a casual visitor visiting Mr. Walker, who owned the shipyard and who was their employer. I was fascinated with what they said, and I found it difficult to accept everything that was said. However, I believe that they were sincere. I do not believe that either of them at that time was putting on.
Charlie and Calvin's story seems so incredible that it attracted professional doctors, scientists, and hypnotists from the entire country to test the validity of their encounter, or to discredit it. Surprisingly, it was these hypnosis sessions, polygraph tests, and examinations that deemed this as one of the most authentic UFO sightings in history. Recently, in a phone interview with Dr. James Harder, a professor at the University of California, he told us of his initial hypnosis session with Charles Hickson, which took place within 36 hours of the abduction. Dr. James Harder is a professor of engineering in Berkeley, California, also an investigator of UFOs. We want to thank you for joining us here on In Contact this evening, Dr. Harder. As I understand it, you flew to Pascagoula within 36 hours of Charlie Hickson and Calvin Parker's contact, and shortly thereafter placed both men under hypnosis. Of course, Dr. Heineck, also Dr. Bosco, and Dr. Bridges present, and we would like you to, if you would, tell us what transpired and what conclusions you arrived at.
Well, I arrived Saturday morning, which was in the midst of an enormous amount of confusion. We were more or less holed up or besieged in the office where Charlie worked, and outside there were all kinds of TV people and other people anxious to get the story. We were trying to do, as investigators, a job of determining exactly what additional information Charlie or Calvin might have remembered under hypnosis. With some difficulty, we managed to get things calmed down, and I hypnotized Charlie with the notion that we wouldn't ask him to go through any of his experience, but just see if he could go into hypnosis. He did, and he lost a terrific headache, and he was much pleased, I believe, by that. He told an incredible story to the people there, although it's not quite so incredible to those of us who have other kinds of investigations we've conducted. I think particularly telling is his recalling that he was levitated as he was taken aboard the craft. Now, I don't think Charlie at the time was sufficiently sophisticated to know that that happens fairly frequently. It wouldn't be something I should think that he would have made up. But it was an extraordinary story, and I think he's able to tell it in his own words better than I am. But I had no doubt at any time that he wasn't telling the truth as he knew it, and that the case was not an excellent one from the standpoint of credibility.
We talked about whether to tell someone or to not say nothing to no one. But we felt like we needed to tell someone, but we didn't know who to tell. So we decided to call Keesler, and Keesler told us they didn't want anything to do with this, to call our local sheriff department. So we did. We stopped and called the local sheriff department, and now I don't have any idea what time and all this was taking place. So after we called our local sheriff department, they sent a patrol car out to pick us up at Charlie's apartment.
The pair did go to the Jackson County Sheriff's Office. Fred Diamond was the county sheriff at the time.
We questioned them at length, and then we left the room and recorded all the conversation they had.
We had it on tape. Captain Ryder taped it all while he was interviewing him on the level.
Okay, now they didn't realize that this was being recorded.
They didn't know that it was being didn't realize that it was being taped or anything. And so it's been so long, it's kind of hard for me to remember everything, but I do know that when I was talking to him, I taped it.
The recording referred to was to become a vital piece of evidence in making this one of the most credible UFO incidents in modern history. After being questioned separately, Charlie and Calvin were later left alone in the same room at the sheriff's station, and little did they realize at the time that they were being recorded.
This is not a heart attack, right? And one damage you died. Jesus Christ. Of course, it went bad back there, nobody believes. That's what I thought. I had been through enough of hell on this earth, and now I got to go through something like this. See?
I was still suspended there. I didn't know, there wasn't anything I could do. I just kept thinking, you know, what are they going to do with me? Are they going to take me away? Or I couldn't imagine what they were going to do or what they were doing with me. But anyhow, after a while, these things came back, and they took hold of me, and we seemed to turn there in the room, and we moved back out the doorway, and they moved back to almost the exact spot that they had picked me up from, and they just released me, and I fell to the ground. Well, it was this time that I saw Calvin again, and he was standing there in front of the river with his arms outstretched, and he appeared to me to be going in shock. and I was trying to get up to my feet to make it to him to see if I could help him some way. And I heard that hissing sound again, and I looked behind me, and I saw those blue lights just instantly, and this craft just went away. Well, I made my way on the cabin, and I could get up on my feet by this time, and it took me a while to get him where I could talk to him and assure him that maybe, you know, that we weren't hurt bad, I know, you know, but we really didn't know what they had done to us.
Eddie, on October 11th, 1973, you were stationed in Okinawa in the U.S. Marines, and you didn't hear about the encounter from your mother and father. You read about it in Stars and Stripes. Could you tell us about your reaction and what it felt like to find out about that this way?
Yes, my first reaction was shock because I really didn't understand what had happened to my father. And when I read the parts about where Dr. Harder and Dr. Hynek came down to do an investigation, I didn't really understand what all that involved. That led me to believe that there may have been some harm done to him. I had no way of finding out other than waiting for a letter to come from home. And the articles in the paper were just bits and pieces, you might say. 2 men were picked up and were boarded a UFO on the Pascagoula River in Pascagoula, Mississippi. And basically that's all that was in the paper, the first article. I think there was 2 articles that followed that maybe in a week's time, but it didn't give me much more information than that. And I really didn't know what to think.
How did the other members of your company react?
They reacted sort of surprised. There was several guys in my company there from Mississippi. They were quite concerned because we had been stationed at other bases together. Nobody ridiculed me. They were quite interested in it. They were as anxious as I was to find out some information from home to see what really happened. And they were just basically good-natured about it, you know.
Tisha, at the time of your father and Calvin's encounter, you were a very small child, so young that you don't even really remember the encounter. But the years have come and gone. We're here 14 years later, and the book, UFO, Contact at Pascagoula, has been published. Your father and Calvin's story has been on the front page of the major newspaper here on the Gulf Coast, as well as some of the smaller newspapers. Tell us about the years growing up. Was there ever a time that you had any doubt about their story? And also, if you would, the reaction of your friends and acquaintances outside of the family.
Well, I've never doubted my parents. I believe everything they say. And my friends have supported me real well, and they've always been there. There's been no ridicule towards me or towards the book. And everybody's just been real good to me.
Blanche, if it could all be done over again, would you prefer that Charlie and Calvin didn't report this incident?
No, I'd want him to report it. I certainly would. Because it's happened to him, and he's proven it's happened to him, and it's all true.
So regardless of any of the frustrations or problems that it may have created over the years, if any, you would still want it to be reported and for people to know?
I certainly would. It was real frightening to me that night and scary. It was hard for me to believe, you know, just like everybody else. You know, I guess they thought the same thing I did. You know, we didn't know if it was real or what happened. But the next day I knew it did happen to him. And from days on and weeks on and months on, I knew it happened to him because he had cold sweats. Had to change his sheets at least 2 and 3 times a night from cold sweats. And he's never been the same since, and I haven't either.
You did not weather through all of this quite as well as Charles did. You experienced a couple of breakdowns, is that correct?
Yeah, I really wouldn't say it was a severe nervous breakdown or anything, but it's just more stress than what I could handle because I had more things, you know, going on, trying to make a living. I was getting married in that year, the same year, just about a month after this happened. And it's just so much pressure on me, I just couldn't stand it, you know. So I pretty much stayed out of the media, and, you know, there was a time or two that I had to go in the hospital on account of my nerves. And, you know, I still have problems with my nerves.
Okay, at one point you even relieved a reporter of his camera.
Yes, sir, I did. I'd had so many reporters, I mean, no privacy whatsoever. And I was just tired of reporters. So the one from the press, I believe it was the Mississippi Press, came up, was taking pictures, and I told him, you know, let's not do this today. This not in the program here. So he wouldn't listen, so I had to take his old camera away and throw it down. Take his old film out and all for him.
Charlie's story has since appeared in many national and international publications, becoming one of the most documented accounts of a UFO experience in history. Huge write-ups in periodicals like The Globe, The Examiner, The National Star, and many other magazines have been done about this major encounter in Mississippi. In turn, many renowned international UFO experts have become aware of the Pascagoula story and have already begun calling on Charlie Hickson. Charlie started to receive hundreds of letters from people around the world who had had their own experiences with extraterrestrial life. Of course, some of the letters weren't to be taken seriously at all and proved suspect after the first paragraph. But many of the correspondents wrote of the comfort they felt after reading about the adversity Charlie faced after his ordeal. Some relate their own encounters and then ask Charlie to shed light upon a topic that keeps these contactees suspect in public view. There are hopeful letters that request Charlie to be an intermediary for opening up channels of communication to the extraterrestrial beings. In these letters, expectations run high that Charlie Hickson will someday be contacted again by aliens. There are religious groups and ministers who write him encouragement and profess daily support for his endeavors in their prayers, and they also write to Charlie about how the spirituality of the church and its encompassing of all God's creatures can inspire those who believe that humans are not alone in this universe. In 1974, a year after his UFO experience, Charlie made a record at the Gulf Coast Recording Studio. With this record, Charles Hickson UFO Story Parts 1 and 2, Charlie hoped to explain himself publicly and, in his own words, exactly what happened the night of October 11th, 1973.
I believe these things are making preparations to communicate in some way with our government. Only time will tell.
In 1983, Charlie co-wrote a book entitled UFO Contact in Pascagoula with investigative reporter William Mendez. Published by Wendell C. Stevens in Tucson, Arizona, the book scrutinized every angle of Charlie and Calvin's experience. Included is original testimony, testimony under hypnosis, a psychological report, scientific analysis, and an appendix of theoretical arguments that covers many of the questions Charlie has run across over the years. In his introduction, William Mendez explains the reasons why he decided to help Charlie with such a book and how he had to maintain his objectivity even as the evidence in Charlie's case grew seemingly more fantastic. UFO Contact in Pascagoula contains photographs and maps which depict the places and events that have become the shocking reality of Charlie Hickson's life. Speculation as to whether or not the federal government has actual proof that UFOs do indeed exist has been a major topic of discussion since the 1947 Roswell, New Mexico incident. Most ufologists believe the Air Force is under direct orders from the Pentagon to debunk UFOs. Stan Friedman, a nuclear physicist from New Brunswick, Canada, who has been a guest on all the major networks, recently spoke of the government's premier top-secret UFO team, Majestic 12, and of the crash in New Mexico.
Yeah, it happened 40 years ago, July 1947, within 2 weeks of when the first big public noise began about flying saucers, and apparently one ran into a big storm of flying saucer, exploded. Pieces were scattered over an area 3/4 of a mile long and 1/4 mile wide, and as it turns out, as determined by an aerial surveillance a few days later, after an initial statement was made by the government that they now had one of these flying discs that people had been seeing, that 4 bodies were discovered 2 miles away, somewhat disturbed by predators of various sorts. According to a document that's just recently been released, a top-secret eyes-only document, this led to the establishment of a team, a super special team of 12 people reporting only to the president, including the Secretary of Defense and the first 3 heads of the Central Intelligence Group, incidentally. And that group is apparently still in place, trying to figure out the technology, having evaluated the bodies to say they're not from a common biological background with us, and expressing concern with public panic. The key agency, Majestic 12 it was called. Everything we found so far, and we've been doing some very hard looking, seems to suggest that this document is genuine. And it's a very exciting twist of events because we were able to check the information in it about Roswell against the data we had from all these people that we had talked to. And we can't find anything in disagreement with what we already knew on that score. And we've checked all the people, and they all had high-level security clearances, just the kind of people you'd expect to be involved in this kind of thing. We've also checked dates when people supposedly got together, and again, everything checks out. For example, the document was actually a briefing document for President-elect Eisenhower, November 18th, 1952, 2 weeks after he was elected for the first time, and we were able to establish that he did indeed receive a briefing from at least one member of Majestic 12 on that date, according to the New York Times.
Leonard Stringfield, noted author and UFO crash site investigator, talks of a recent UFO crash and government cover-up in the southeast of the United States.
A very recent one of interest occurred in western Kentucky, just about 6 or 7 months ago, and the skeletal remains of two creatures, not human or animal, were found on a farm. A doctor who lives in western, I can't name it, I'm not allowed to even name the town, mind you, but anyway, a doctor owns who is retired, owns a large tract of land, farmland, and in making one of his occasional strolls on his property, he ran across these two sets of bones in a little burned out area. And he estimated that the bone remains, some of them with ligaments attached to the bonal structure, had been there for 4 or 5 months, which would put it back to possibly the end of last year, or the first of the year. So he in turn called the sheriff, and the sheriff in turn called the military, and they sent from Fort Campbell in Kentucky, they sent 3 helicopters the following morning. Now, this is according to the doctor. They had sent the 20 people came out of the, over 20 people came out of the 3 helicopters, some military, some civilian, and just took over the whole property. And with sophisticated equipment, they managed to get the area where the bones were and also the burned out area. And then they returned the next morning with some new dirt, with dirt fill to cover up everything, make sure nobody got there. See, the doctor was asked not to invite anybody down to see it.
Throughout the years, not all high-level officials have chosen to remain silent on the UFO phenomenon. Clarence Dargy, who worked on the Project Blue Book and is now retired from the Air Force, remembers quotes by General MacArthur and President Reagan.
Let's go back to 1954 with General Douglas MacArthur, and we're all aware of that's a household word, household name, everyone knows, and of course I lived during the period when he was active, and history has carried on his name. He was not a man to make flip or idle statements. During one of his press conferences, shortly after he retired from the Army, he was asked at that time to give his opinion as to the chances for mankind's continuation on this earth now that we had invented these horrendous weapons, such as atomic bombs and hydrogen bombs. And he dropped a little bombshell of his own. He said, the greatest danger to mankind's continuation on this earth, he said, will not come from international strife. He said, eventually, he said, all of the nations of the world will have to band together to face a greater threat, and that is a threat from outer space. Now, that is a man who was privy to information that a lot of other sources did not have. Even as late as last year with the summit meeting at the Reykjavik in Iceland. At that time, President Reagan made an offer to Gorbachev, Premier Gorbachev, and said he would be willing to ally our forces with the Russian forces in the event of an invasion from outer space.
J. Allen Hynek was an astrophysicist and consultant from 1948 to 1969 on the Air Force's Project Grudge, which later became the now famous Project Blue Book. Hynek became extremely disenchanted with the Air Force's reluctance in taking UFO sightings seriously. In 1973, he founded the J. Allen Hynek Center for UFO Studies. QFOS was the first research facility established by a scientist and dedicated to the collection, investigation, and analysis of UFO research. Here are some of the most interesting stories out of their recent files. In October of 1973, 1979, Lou Blackburn shot slides of a UFO over a tidal river mouth at Motunau, New Zealand. The pictures were taken while Blackburn was photographing a friend's fishing boat. 15-year-old Franklin Abraham Urey was living in Iran with his parents and younger brother. October 8, 1978, Franklin was playing soccer in his backyard when a strange white object approached him from the sky. Franklin snapped photos from a Kodak camera loaded with 126 color film. From Scotland, 14-year-old James Allen took this picture while photographing a dead volcano. Walking home, he heard a weird humming noise, looked up, saw the object, aimed his Extra 12 camera, and took a picture of the flying object. August 1977, Knut Jensen snapped photographs with his fixed-focused Kodak pocket camera in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. And going back to August 2nd, 1965, Alan Smith was over Tulsa, Oklahoma, and took this photo. And in the early 70s, J. Allen Hynek himself spotted this UFO from an airliner.
Following J. Allen Hynek's death, Donald C. Schmidt became director of the Center for UFO Studies. He is also Wisconsin State Director for the Mutual UFO Network. Author of numerous published articles and newspaper columns on UFOs, he has lectured widely on the subject and has frequently been interviewed by TV and radio stations, newspapers, and magazines.
Well, the center on an average receives from 2 to 3 reports a day. And when I say the word report, that only means that it comes to us as nothing more than a report. When we talk about legitimate UFO activity, we do explain roughly 90% of the cases that come in. So that leaves us with only a few dozen cases that really stand out as legitimate UFOs at year's end.
And those are cases that you follow up on. Do you go to the locations and investigate them thoroughly?
Right. And in fact, we will assign investigators who work specifically through the center. And if they really warrant scientific investigation, we would actually get involved ourselves as far as the scientific directors of the center.
Could you tell us about some of the most well-known cases that you've investigated through the center?
Well, we're currently working on what has been originally classified as a mini UFO flap in midwestern Wisconsin, where to date, since mid-January, we have about 40 independent reports involving police officers, a number of scientists, and other people. One particular night in question, we had 4 separate police officers involved, all describing essentially the same thing. Cigar-shaped objects, red, white, blue configurations of lights, objects passing directly overhead of cars, EM effects as far as on some of the vehicles. In fact, one of the objects was tracked on radar by the Flight Control Center down in Aurora, Illinois, which confirmed the fact that there was some actual object present that particular evening.
At first, we decided we wouldn't tell anyone. We just keep it to ourselves because, you know, I didn't want to be called nut and crazy. Those things are just not supposed to happen. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that we had to tell someone, maybe the military, because, you know, possibly our country could be a threat to our country. So we stopped on the way home, and I called Keesler Air Force Base from a paid phone, and briefly I tried to explain to them what had happened, but they informed me that they didn't handle those things, that we'd have to go through the local sheriff's department. Well, we hesitated there. We didn't want to go through the sheriff's department because, you know, they might just grab us up and take us on to the nut house. But anyway, we talked it over again and decided we would call the sheriff's department, and maybe we could get him to assure us that we wouldn't have any publicity about it. So I called the sheriff's department, and they sent 2 deputies over, which after talking with us, asked us to follow them to the sheriff's department, and we did. And they questioned us there for several hours, and the sheriff assured me that night that we wouldn't have any publicity about it at all. He would try to maybe report it to the proper authorities, whoever the proper authorities were, and it could be investigated. But the next day, when we reached work, my telephone was ringing, and it was some reporter from Jackson, and then all the telephones at the shipyard started ringing, and they were trying to get information about what happened to Charlie Hickson and Calvin Parker that past night in Pascagoula.
Public awareness about UFOs has increased tremendously in the past few years. In a recent Gallup poll, 15 million Americans claim to have had an actual UFO sighting. The poll went on to say that 51% of all Americans believe that UFOs exist, and 46% believe that there is intelligent life on other planets. Sightings are being reported daily, and people are actively looking to the skies in hopes of catching a glimpse of a UFO. The National Enquirer, a weekly supermarket tabloid, has even gone as far as to offer a $50,000 reward for positive proof that UFOs exist. During the latter part of 1987, Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker were the subject of a series of television shows in the Pascagoula area. The shows were broadcast live by Mississippi Community Television and gave viewers the opportunity to call in and ask questions or direct comments to Charlie and Calvin. In all, 15 shows were aired. During this time, 209 phone calls were taken, and almost all of them expressed support and belief in Charlie and Calvin's story. During these shows, Charlie was often joined by other noteworthy people in the UFO field.
I saw a number of them. Well, the first ones I saw was in Alabama, and they were in the form of the lights that everybody saw. You know, so many people saw over the years, bright moving lights. Some of them, sometimes they changed direction, and they changed colors. The intensity of the light changed. And one time I even saw one break up a flight of airplanes at night. And it fascinated me. I knew there was something going on. I didn't, you know, I was like everybody else. I didn't know what it was, but as a hobby, I kept up with what was published about these objects. And in 1952, a man by the name of George Adamski, this gentleman right here, he took this photograph. He took a series of photographs, but this photograph was the clearest of the ones that he took. And he published it saying it was a UFO, and he took the picture. He had a camera mounted on he was an amateur astronomer, and he had a camera mounted on a 6-inch telescope out in the back of his home in California. And he managed to get this picture and several others, and so he published it, and it went worldwide, became famous, and he kept on giving more information about the photograph, because he said that the people flying this aircraft gave him a ride in it eventually, several rides, and he said they told him they came from other planets. And I honestly, in the beginning, didn't believe the man, but the photograph alone fascinated me. I believed that he saw something, because I saw the objects flying around in form of balls of light and so on, as everybody else did. But I was skeptical about him saying that he took a ride.
At an annual convention of ufology experts, Charlie joined hundreds of other interested people in gathering the latest information dealing with extraterrestrial phenomena. The Mutual UFO Network Symposium brings together people from all over the world to speak about their theories and experiences. Charlie himself joined a panel of speakers who each had their own alleged contact with aliens. He found himself listening with awe and fascination as these perfectly normal people related frightening encounters with strange beings from other worlds. Charlie was also able to seek out advice and gain the camaraderie of famous UFO researchers attending the symposium. The first documented and perhaps most publicized abduction took place on September 19, 1961, in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. Unbeknownst to them at the time, Betty and Barney Hill were taken aboard a spacecraft, examined, and released. The only memory they had of that night was returning home late from their trip and being unable to account for 2 hours during that time. 4 years later, under hypnosis, the whole story finally came to light.
The car motor stalled. They came up on each side, took us out of the car along a path in the woods to where the craft was on the ground, took us on board, said they wanted to find out how we were like them or different from them, and they were going to do some testing. And as soon as the testing was over with, they'd take us back to the car and we'd be able to go home. They took us into separate rooms, and they gave each of us a form of physical examination. And there was one who spoke English. There was a total of 11 altogether. So for purposes of identification, the one who spoke English we called the leader. The one who did the testing we called the examiner, and the 9 others stayed out in the corridor. So we call them the crew members. I was examined first, and then the examiner went into the room where Barney was, and I was beginning to overcome some of my terror and beginning to relax. And I said to the leader, I know you're not from this planet. I'd like to know where you're from. He showed me a star map, and he explained it to me briefly. And then later, Dr. Simon gave me the post-hypnotic suggestion that if I'd like to, I'd be able to sketch the map, which I did. Well, this became important later because Marjorie Fish, who at that time was a school teacher in Ohio, did the research and found out that this pattern of stars that I had sketched actually exists. And she was able to identify these. I mean, this took many years. For one thing, her research was handicapped by, I had two stars on the map that our astronomers had not found. But later they did. And that completed the research.
Kurt, October 11th, 1973 was the first of several encounters for your father. One I would like to speak with you about specifically is May of 1974, Mother's Day, when you were with your father and you had a sighting with him and several other members of your family. Would you tell us about that?
Oh, yes. We were traveling back from Jones County, coming back from Mother's Day, up at my grandmother's house, and we had come out of a little town called Sochi there, headed back, and I had noticed a light back over to the right. I was real young then, and kept on watching it. Come on around the car. It was still a pretty good ways off, and it come on around to the left there and kind of slowed down. It kind of got closer to us, and then my brother-in-law was driving the car. He had slowed the car down some. The light had got brighter and come on around and come in front of the car, I would say 500 yards off, and just kind of hovered over the road like enough where you could tell the lights and see what it looked like and all. After he kind of like was going to speed back up, it kind of picked back up again, and off to the right, it went back off to the right again, and you could see what it looked like it had landed back in there with them tall pine trees there. And it was something that I won't never forget. I can always say that I've seen one for myself, you know, to know that they are real.
And your dad, he tried to get out of the car.
Right, he tried to get out of the car, and my mother, she was all in hysterics. She didn't want him to get out, and after she had done about to went in hysterics, he decided, well, he wouldn't get out that time. I reckon he figured his mind there would be another time.
Tell me about your life since that night, October 11th, 1973.
Well, it's not much to tell about. I've been through a couple of bad relationships, bad marriages, and most of it was my fault. You know, I wouldn't say it was my wife's fault during the time. Nerve problems, changed jobs, you know, several different times. Just a lot of different things.
As a whole, I think the public has been real decent to me. I haven't had any ridicule over all these years. I think that's because I've been honest. And when people wanted to ask me questions about it and talk about it, I took up my time to do it.
Religion, far from being at odds from science, may itself be a vague and distorted memory of things once known, things we're beginning to rediscover through science. However, the religious convictions of many are a considerable source of bias in the matter of extraterrestrial visitors. Recently, we talked with Ted Peters, a Lutheran minister and professor of systematic theology at Pacific Lutheran Seminary, about his philosophic views, which are shared by many.
I've read the book of Revelation many times. I've taught courses on the book of Revelation. There's absolutely nothing in there about aliens putting human beings here on Earth. I think that we can ask seriously whether or not there might be intelligent life on other planets. But I don't think that we need to necessarily pin it on the Bible to do that. I know there are some people who say that the belief that people live on other planets come to us from the devil. I think that that's wrong. I remember remember Charles Hickson saying one time when I quizzed him, I asked him, how did your experience with the UFO change your religious beliefs? And he said, well, it didn't change them much. I'm a hard-shell Baptist. And he said, but now I have a picture of the bigness of God's creation. In many ways, I think that the most thoughtful theologians say exactly the same thing, that God created the whole cosmos, and if there are intelligent beings on other planets, then they're part of the divine creation as well. And whether the Bible says that or not, it's certainly an exciting thought to ponder.
Man has always had an unquenchable thirst for knowledge. A never-ending search for this knowledge has taken him into the boundless expanse of the universe. On April 12, 1961, Russian cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first man to leave Earth's atmosphere and travel into space. On July 16, 1969, Neil Armstrong became the first man to set foot on another celestial body, the Moon.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
By 1974, our space probes were exploring the outer atmospheres of Mars, Venus, and Mercury. On June 19, 1976, Viking 1 landed on the surface of Mars in search of living organisms. What it found shocked the world. As far as the eye could see, there was desert, similar to the Mojave Desert on Earth. Canyons so large that they could stretch from New York to San Francisco. River channels larger than the largest rivers on Earth. Scientists believe that water once ran on the surface of Mars, and that huge glaciers once covered parts of the landscape. After further examination, it was believed that the atmosphere on Mars was once conducive to the sustainment of life. In less than a lifetime, man has come from utter astonishment at the Wright brothers' first rickety plane ride to curious observation of the pictures and information received from our interplanetary probes. Due to information gathered by probes such as Mariner and Voyager, scientists have deduced that the formation of planets around a star is a fairly common occurrence in the universe, a process which is still occurring today. Given this idea, along with the relatively recent discoveries in biochemistry and astronomy, extraterrestrial life is now an acceptable notion in the scientific community. Man has always been reluctant to believe what he cannot comprehend. Where space travel was once the myth of comic books and adventure films, it is now a commonplace method of further exploring our celestial backyard. Where once extraterrestrial life was considered fiction and fantasy, the vast amounts of research and eyewitness reports now seem to put it in a credible perspective. Perhaps one day, our questions will be answered. Perhaps one day, man and extraterrestrial life will be in contact.
Sometimes I think maybe I shouldn't have told anyone what happened to me here on this Pascagoula River many years ago. But then again, I realized that I did right by telling what happened. I think most of the people knows where man has been. I think I know where we're going. Maybe someday I can help convince the world to that fact. I know there's other worlds out there with life on it, and someday everyone will know that to be a fact without any doubt.